Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer. And today I'm very excited because we're going to bring you our first ever top 10 list. But before we get into that, remember to like, comment, subscribe. Remember, we are found here on Ampire Media, home of the John Keim Report, which can be found on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. But before I get into the top 10, which I've been excited about all month to get into, I do have 20 seconds worth of reactions to the previous weeks of games. Number one, I'm very impressed by Notre Dame's resilience, and despite the loss, I am still very high on them, as you'll see in my list. Number two, I was right about USC's defense, and I will continue to be right. They will not make the Final Four, let alone maybe not even the Pac-12 championship game, with a defense that bad. It very nearly cost them a 4-touchdown lead, and had Colorado not taken 4.5 minutes to drive down at the end of the game, they very well could have lost that game. Number three, LSU's defense is a much bigger cause for concern for them. They're obviously out of the playoff race. They're probably out of the SEC West race. I was super high on them to begin the year just because I thought Brian Kelly, Jaden Daniel just didn't work out. We have now successfully put the previous week to bed. Let's look ahead. But let's get to our top 10, our very first Between the Hashes top 10 list. Number 10, Notre Dame. I'm still very impressed by Notre Dame's defense. Their running game, Estime has been a very, very good running back. Sam Hartman still hasn't thrown an interception. We're halfway into the season, especially they are, because they just played their 6th game. For them to go on a road in a hostile territory against a team that was very amped up to play them, following a heartbreaking loss and play with the resiliency that they did is nothing short of impressive, and I still think they're one of the best teams in the country. Number 9, USC. I'm putting USC here because they don't have a loss and Notre Dame does. I don't like their defense at all, and so that lack of a defense, like with most Lincoln Riley teams, gives them a very defined ceiling. However, Caleb Williams kind of automatically makes them a top 10 team, and so they're going to still be in pretty much every game they're in as long as he's there. And it's kind of a shame we're watching one of the best quarterbacks in college football history get wasted like this. Number 8, Washington. Now, this might be the first of my controversial takes on this list. I like Washington. Washington has been playing at a super elite level. Michael Penix Jr. has been the odds-on favorite to win the Heisman this year, and he would very honestly deserve it. If it's not Caleb Williams again, he would be the next pick. The issue is that they just haven't really played anybody. Going into the Arizona game, they have the 94th ranked strength of schedule. Well, frankly, we'll know more about them when they play Oregon next week. More on that next week. Number 7, Penn State. Drew Aller has looked really, really good as a quarterback. Their line play has been fantastic all year, and their opening season win against a West Virginia team that was picked to finish last in the Big 12 has actually aged pretty well. West Virginia is now 4-1. The problem is that some of their defensive numbers have certainly been inflated by playing some really bad offensive teams, notably Iowa, and they have struggled whenever they've gone on the road. And so it's not that I don't believe in Penn State, it's just kind of like with Washington, I need to see a little bit more, but like by the end of the month, we'll know more about Penn State. They play Ohio State in a few weeks. Number 6, I kind of went back and forth between putting Oregon and Florida State in this spot. I'm gonna go with Oregon. I think Oregon's far away the best team in the Pac-12. I think they're in the driver's seat for a playoff spot in that conference, assuming that conference doesn't cannibalize itself. Everybody's really good, which means that lots of good teams are going to start beating other lots of good teams multiple times. And so it's going to be really chaotic for the next 6 weeks in that conference. That said, their line play looks a lot better than last year. Bo Nix looks like a legitimate Heisman contender. And I'm happy that Bo Nix has had the career resurgence that he has. That win over Colorado, especially after USC struggled with them, looks really, really good in hindsight. But again, I personally think Colorado is maybe like a 6-win team, 6 or 7-win team. So let's pump the brakes on some of these teams until they start playing competition. But again, Oregon and Washington play each other next week, so some of this stuff will start to sort itself out. Number 5, like I said with the Oregon placement at number 6, I kind of struggled between putting them here or the team I did with Florida State. Now, why I'm not super high or super sold on Florida State, they've looked kind of shaky against really bad teams. Like, they probably should have lost to Boston College, and they almost certainly should have lost to Clemson. They were outplayed for the majority of both of those games. That doesn't change the fact that they won. And I know that the LSU win has lost a lot of its luster. LSU's floor is probably 8 wins this year, so they're still not a bad team. And even though Clemson is having a down year, they did something they haven't done in almost 10 years in beating them, let alone in Death Valley. So they have one of the best resumes, but I'm not sure that team is going to hold up as they progress through more difficult parts of the schedule, like when they have to play Miami, because Tyler Van Dyke has been playing really, really well. Still not entirely sold on Miami as a team, but I think they have what it takes to beat Florida State. Probably the two most difficult games on its schedule behind them. Florida State, all they have to do is not trip up for the rest of the year, and they're probably in a playoff spot. Because of that, because of how Jordan Travis and Keon Coleman and people like that look, you have to respect them, and they're a top 5 team for me. Number 4, I might get a bit of a reaction for this one, the Georgia Bulldogs. So there's a couple schools of thought with ranking defending national champions, let alone 2-time defending national champions. One of the schools of thought is that they're number 1 until proven otherwise, until someone beats them. And I have used that logic with picking them in certain individual games. But just because the uniforms are there and just because Brock Bowers is still there doesn't mean that this team that exists this year right now is the same team that beat Ohio State in TCU, or a year before that destroyed Michigan and beat Alabama. That said, they've won something like 21 or 22 straight games. Kirby Smart is still recruiting at an amazingly elite level. The problem is that they just don't quite look the same. And so they're kind of a hard team to diagnose. On one hand, you could make the argument that this is kind of what they did last year. They arguably should have lost to Missouri last year. You know, they just kind of sleepwalk through the bad parts of their schedule, and then they turn it on when they need to as the season gets more and more difficult. So you certainly can have that outlook on this Georgia team because it's something we've seen play out multiple times in the past. The more cynical outlook to take, and the outlook I'm starting to fall on, is that they're rushing for a whole less yard per game than they did last year. Their line play just isn't what it's been. Auburn was able to run up and down the field on them. And sure, they did enough to win that Auburn game, but to be honest, they've only played 2 Power 5 teams, both of whom SEC, with South Carolina and Auburn, neither of whom were projected to be all that great going into this year, and they were down double digits in the second half in both games. And they're playing probably the one competent team on their schedule this week in Kentucky. And Kentucky has an amazing rushing offense and a really, really good defense. Do they have the horses to compete with Georgia? Remains to be seen. I'm going to talk about that in my lightning round. But Georgia, there's a lot of warning signs, and to be honest, their schedule is so easy that I honestly think that even one loss should arguably knock them out of the playoff, just because they have, like, if you lose to one of these teams, especially kind of the manner that it's been going, they're just living too much on the edge for me to feel comfortable with them. And I think as of this moment, any of the 3 teams ahead of them that I have ahead of them would beat them. The good news for Georgia is that they are still undefeated, and so until someone knocks them off, they're still going to be in it. All right, number 3, Ohio State. Coming out of a bye week following that dramatic victory over Notre Dame, they play an interesting test in Maryland, who boasts probably one of the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten currently, with Tualia Tagovailoa, Tua's younger brother, former Alabama player. One of the interesting things is that Ohio State gave up tons of big yardage plays. They've been a lot better defending against that sort of thing this year, and so we'll be able to see just how well that holds up. Because I just waxed poetic about how high I am on Notre Dame this year, consequentially, I think Ohio State has one of the 2 best wins in the country as of right now with that Notre Dame win. So from a resume standpoint, you have to put them up there. Ohio State is definitely going through, kind of like Georgia or Alabama or somebody like that, they're definitely going through growing pains because they lost almost everybody on offense. But Kyle McCord has shown that he can step it up when he needs to. The receiving core is still elite. Ryan Day is still one of the best coaches in the country. Their recruiting is still at a very high level. I'm curious to see what kind of momentum they have coming out of this bye, now that the champagne from that dramatic victory has dried out a little bit. I still have questions about some of their offensive line plays, especially in the short yardage rushing situations, but their defense looks fantastic. And I would take that defense against almost everybody in the country right now. That's how impressed I have been with their defense, with the exception of their lack of a overwhelming pass rush. But for the most part, their defense has been really stout, and Jim Knowles has been doing a really good job. And so, because of that, Ohio State is at number 3. Number 2. All right, if you guys know who I am or who my dad is, you'll know that this kind of physically hurts me to do, but I have to put Michigan here. Michigan's beat them 2 years in a row. Michigan brought back almost everybody from a team that won the Big Ten for the second year in a row, made the playoffs for a second year in a row. And Michigan hasn't really had a good schedule just yet. That said, Michigan's gone out and done what they needed to do. Sure, they looked shaky at points, but they might be the sleepwalkers more than Georgia are. And Michigan kind of has the benefit of the doubt at this point. McCarthy is now the full-time starter. He looks just as good as you'd expect. He's really taken a step forward from last year. You'll know that I wasn't the highest on him last year just because he really didn't show much as a downfield threat as a passer until the Ohio State game. But he's been really, really good this year. And one thing to remember with Michigan is that they played their first 3 games without Jim Harbaugh. He's back now. We might see a slightly different energy as that team continues to roll through the Big Ten schedule. Which brings us to number 1, the Texas Longhorns. So I might trust Michigan more than Texas, but Texas has done more to justify its ranking, if that makes sense. So Texas has far and away the best win in the country, beating Alabama by double digits in Tuscaloosa. And nobody's won in Tuscaloosa since LSU in 2019, and we saw how that went. This Texas team looks really dominant on defense, on the line play. Steve Sarkisian has really stepped it up. Quinn Ewers has taken a lot of steps forward as a passer. Half this team's going to get drafted. We'll see another massive test for them this week against Oklahoma. This might be the best Texas team since Colt McCoy was there. So if that's the standard of comparison we're using, those Texas teams were always top 3, playing in the Fiesta Bowl, playing in the championship. They're that good. Now, can they get through the rest of their schedule? And there's a very good chance that even if they beat Oklahoma this weekend, they have to play them again a month or 2 from now. We'll see, but right now I think Texas has done more than enough to earn its top spot in the rankings. That is my top 10 this week, which brings us to the lightning round. Big week in the SEC here, guys. Bama goes on the road to Texas A&M. Ever since their loss to Miami, Texas A&M has made a change at quarterback, mainly due to injury, but this is the type of quarterback that is kind of prone to giving Alabama fits. Alabama's only favored by 2 on the road. I think that's a fair line. It's kind of a popular upset pick, but to be honest, Texas A&M doesn't have a whole lot of consistency either on offense or just in general as a team over the last few years. A&M definitely has the defense and the quarterback to get it done. I just don't know that they have the consistency, and I just think the coaching advantage here is going to give Alabama the win. So Alabama wins, they cover. We have Missouri and LSU in the Battle of the Tigers. It's kind of baffling to see LSU still ranked when you have undefeated Power 5 teams not ranked. Complaining about the AP poll aside, LSU is favored on the road. Missouri is almost a touchdown underdog at home. Missouri's quietly made it through the month of September undefeated, especially after that upset win over Kansas State. I kind of want to pick LSU because I think Brian Kelly and that team is just too talented to lose 3 of their first 6 games, but their defense has not shown up at all. They have been super bad, and I don't trust them. It's just kind of hard to pick against Missouri at home in this one, so I'm going to say Missouri not only covers the spread, but they win. All right, next one. Kentucky goes to Athens to play Georgia. Georgia's a 14.5-point favorite, and if I were a betting person, I would stay far away from this game. But in the interest of this show, I like Kentucky to cover the spread here, but I think Georgia wins, which is kind of how Georgia's season has been playing out so far. Like I said, Georgia's had to make multiple double-digit comebacks against much, much inferior teams, and this is probably the best team remaining on their schedule, unless Tennessee wakes up or something like that. This is going to be the best team they play until December, so that 14.5-point line is just way too much for me. I give Kentucky the points, but Georgia the win. All right, we're going to leave the SEC and go way out west to Southern California, where Washington State visits UCLA. They are road underdogs to an unranked team. So the thing with the Pac-12 this year is that they have been far and away the best conference. They have 4 or 5 quarterbacks, maybe even more, who are getting talked about as first-round draft picks. Washington State has one of those with Cam Ward, who has led the team in passing and rushing. They look fantastic. Cam Ward looks like one of the best quarterbacks in the country. UCLA is a dangerous team. Chip Kelly's a really good coach, and despite the fact that UCLA lost a lot of seniors on last year's team, the new group seems fairly competent, an ugly loss against Utah aside. That said, I think Washington State has something special cooking here, so I'm going to give Washington State the statistical upset. They cover the spread, and they win the game. I'm choosing lots of dogs this week. But hey, I only went 1-4 last week, so I had to change something. Anyways, that brings us to our headliner game of the week. Red River Shootout. All right, rivalry. We know what the game is called. Texas versus Oklahoma. You're going to have Baker Mayfield on College Game Day picking those games. You're going to have Colt McCoy's talking about potentially showing up. This is one of the best rivalry games. It's this kind of rivalry game where it doesn't really matter how bad or how good either team is. What happens on that field is almost completely independent of that every single year, and that's why this game is so much fun. But this year, they're both undefeated, although they took very different paths to get there. Oklahoma, because of the conference realignment, Oklahoma lost the Georgia game, and so they kind of had a bit of a nothing burger of a schedule. But on the other hand, they started out 5-0 after a year where Brent Venables was destroyed in the media following his first season last year. They have a top 10 passing offense. They have a top 10 scoring defense. They have one of the best passing offenses in the country. They're 24th in total D, but 4th in scoring defense, which suggests a bit of a bend but don't break kind of thing there. And I think Brent Venables got blamed for a situation that Lincoln Riley created there, if that makes sense. The cupboard was left fairly bare following Lincoln Riley's exit, and so it was always going to take some time to rebuild. Dillon Gabriel is back. He's healthy. He's playing well, and this is Oklahoma's first real test. And statistically, at least from an offensive perspective, these two teams are really similar. Texas is only averaging .04 more yards per game. Oklahoma's actually averaging more pass yards per game, but we're going to get into the reason for that in a little bit. And the defenses, depending on which metric you use, are statistically similar. Now, if you go to the Texas side of the equation, like I said, I just think they're more battle-tested. Even though their passing numbers look slightly weaker in comparison, part of the reason for that is that they haven't needed to throw as much as Oklahoma. They're built from the trenches, and so they're okay beating you with the run or with the pass or with a pass rush. I think they're a lot more versatile both on offense and defense this year than they have been in years past, and I'm going to pick Texas to win and cover. The spread is 6. I think that's a fair line for Texas. I think Texas has the ability to control this game. I know that you could say that the Kansas win is actually sneaky impressive. Problem being is that Kansas's best player got hurt and was announced out the day of the game. And so throw out the Kansas win, but they've done what they needed to do. There's a couple of games that they just played, like Baylor or Wyoming even, where it could very easily have been a letdown game, but they got past it. And like I said, I put Texas as my number 1 team. If I were to rank 11 through 15, it would probably be some combination of Washington State, Oklahoma, Alabama, etc. So I think Brent Venables has Oklahoma going in the right direction. I just think this is a very special Texas team, and I think Quinn Ewers is going to go out there and outplay Dillon Gabriel. Like I said, Texas wins, they cover. And that is all for this week on Between the Hashes. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. Remember to check back for more updates on the Washington Commanders from the John Keim Report. That can be found here on Ampire Media, here on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next week.